Okay, so here I go. Yes, sorry, I'm doing this on a computer that I don't know, so I don't know if Prezi is going to be the best. This might be tricky. I'm not used to Macs, so I'll do my best. So my title is Faith, Trust, and Hopeful Acceptance. And let me get you into the question I want to ask in the thesis. So here's a set of ordinary language claims about faith involving the faith that locution, which is familiar to all of you probably here working on faith. So here's a few. A student struggling in a logic class, you might say, has faith that he will eventually master the material and pass the class. A husband has faith that what his wife says is true. A wife has faith that her husband will keep his marital vows. A person suffering from OCD comes to have faith that he locked the door, despite being inclined to worry that he didn't. A friend has faith that a confidant will keep a secret. A father has faith that his teenage son will not wreck the car. An addict has faith that this time he will refrain from giving in to the addiction. The addict's friend has faith that the addict will succeed in resisting the addiction. A philosophy student has faith that his car hasn't been stolen, even after he's been convinced that he doesn't know how to answer Hume's problem of induction. An employee of a nonprofit organization has faith that her efforts will make the world a better place. An overconfident gambler has faith that he will win his bet. And a Christian has faith that God exists. So, just a couple of quick points. I mean, I made it so only the last was a case of religious attribution of faith, so it's got a broader use here. Most of them are pretty, I think, positive for the most. They have, at least to my mind, a kind of positive cast. The last one will be controversial. The overconfident gambler, you shouldn't do that. But other things being equal. So here's, get Dan back. There he is. So, as you know, I mean, there have been several attempts in the literature to give an account of propositional faith, the sort of faith that takes the that clause. And here's Dan's, nice account. I think, although I'm going to put it in question a bit, but overall I'm pretty sympathetic to the project and even to this sort of framework. So Dan says to have faith that P is a complex propositional attitude consisting of a positive evaluation of P, so you got to think it's good or better than the alternative. A positive conative orientation toward P. Conative is like desire, right, or preference, or something. So you've got to have that sort of psychological attitude, positive attitude. And then a positive cognitive stance toward P. And then finally, resilience to new counter-evidence to P. So these other states have to be resilient in some way to counter-evidence. And then there's a prerequisite. P has to be epistemically suboptimal, in some way. So I like thinking about propositional faith, and I'm pretty attracted to the view that it names at least one state that's important, and that even, sorry, I don't mean to grab that, okay, that even that that the state that it names might serve as a kind of way that you could develop accounts of other interesting uses of faith. The most interesting, to my mind, is having faith in a person, or having faith in someone to do something, having faith in God in the religious case. I'm somewhat optimistic that if you start with the propositional faith, you might be able to develop an account of those other sorts. And here's one way to put. We went back to Dan, sorry. One way, apologies here. So one way to put Dan's point is that, there is this, sorry, Here's one thing that I think is exactly right, and I'll support it. There is this sort of hopeful cognitive stance paradigm, is what I'm going to call it, where, if you believe a proposition and I'm going to put all that conative and evaluative stuff into just one phrase, and Dan uses this nice term too. Being for a proposition, being for its being the case, more specifically. So, believing and being for a proposition's being the case, can give rise to faith that claims. That seems right, and it also seems to capture something important. And maybe you need to. Not everything that Dan has in his account is over here, so maybe it needs to be tweaked. There's the big question of whether it's belief or some other weaker cognitive state. I'm going to kind of sidestep those. I want to think about the desire and evaluative components of it. And I want to question this other direction, whether to have faith that P requires having the positive, being for the proposition, having the positive attitudes. And so, call that the conative evaluative requirement, the idea that S has faith that P only if S is for the truth of P. So I think this is common to, I think all of the recent accounts of faith, include something like this. They don't always include it as you've got it, like Dan does, as thinking that propositional faith is a hybrid attitude that involves it. Sometimes they're kind of a prerequisite, That's the way Laura Buchak has it. A proposition just to be a contender for being a case of faith, you got to have some hope that it's true or something like that. But that's not what faith is, on her view. But she still would agree with this, conditional. S has faith that P only if S is for the truth of P. So, but here are the main claims. As I said, my big question is whether this is true, and my thesis is kind of complicated because I think the answer is kind of complicated. And if I could just back up. Okay, I'm going to stop touching it for a second. So here's my main thesis. First of all, I think not every felicitous use of faith that in language obeys the conative affective requirement. There are some cases where it's appropriate to say people have faith that P, but they don't. They're not for the truth of P. They don't desire it. They don't even desire to desire it. They don't think it's good. So I think it's not. There's not a univocal sense of faith that is one claim I want to make. But that said, I do want to defend, the idea that there is a sense of faith that the conative evaluative requirement is true of, and that it's important. I think that case can be made, almost just by showing you again that slide of all of the uses of faith that, and a lot of them seem to be this kind of optimism, together with a belief. The nonprofit worker has faith that her efforts will make the world a better place, and it seems to be in part that she wants that to be true, and she also believes it, and maybe she believes it in part because she wants it to be true, or it's influenced in some way. So I want to say there's an important sense of use of faith that does obey the conative evaluative requirement. So if what you really care about is not, who cares about the language, but does it pick out a state that's important? I think, yeah, there's an important notion of faith that gets at a really important phenomenon. The conative evaluative requirement is true of it. But then I want to try to make a slightly stronger claim, and that's that the state that's picked out by this use of faith can also play a role in an account of an important kind of non-propositional faith that's connected with trust, namely having faith in or trusting people to do things. So I want to say that does obey the sort of account that Dan has, or maybe a slightly better account, I think, but it could play a role in capturing that, which I think is a really interesting and important notion, just the notion of trusting someone to do something. So that's the thesis. And I should say this last one, just to forestall a bit of a letdown, I do end on kind of a negative note for it, so then I'm hoping I can help you out with it. So it's almost that I've got faith that this last one's true, but maybe not quite there with the arguments for it. But I still have faith for it. Okay, so is the conative evaluative requirement true, for all uses of faith? Does faith that P, just in ordinary use, require being for P? Here are some arguments for a yes answer to this. Some of these, this first one, is just all over the literature. So one idea is just that makes a good explanation of why some cases of belief don't seem to count as faith, but you can pretty quickly turn that case of belief into faith if you add this pro-attitude, the conative evaluative attitude. So, for instance, Californians like myself it'd be wrong to say that I have faith that a major earthquake will hit in the near future. I have done a little bit of planning for that. I fear that might be true. Probably I believe it, even though I try not to dwell on it. But I don't have faith that it's true. It just doesn't even seem like a contender, right? And it seems like a good reason why is just I don't want that to be true. It's not a proposition I'm for the truth of, right? But you can pretty quickly turn, this proposition, a major earthquake, the big one will hit California, into a case of faith. If you just imagine Dr. Evil saying it, while he's in his lab working on his new earthquake ray, right? Pretty soon a major earthquake will hit these Californians. There it seems like it could count as a case of faith pretty easily, and it looks like the difference is just that's Dr. Evil thinks wants the proposition to be true, and thinks it's good in a sense. Now you need to be careful. The sense in which Dr. Evil thinks it's good is the sense in which Milton's Satan thinks things are good. He says, "Evil be thou my good," So it's not a moral goodness that he thinks, but it fits with his deep values, or there's some sort of an account like that. So here's a second argument. It also seems like the conative evaluative requirement can explain why faith fails to be closed under competent deduction in some cases. So I didn't put the case, a case here I had in mind, but consider this inference. Let me think what the inference is. I don't have it with me now. So think about my son's going to the dentist. He's got a terrible toothache. I have faith that the doctor will heal the toothache, right? I have faith that his toothache will be healed. Now, it might be that a necessary condition of the doctor fixing his toothache is that he get a shot of Novocaine that's going to be slightly painful, right? So a necessary condition of the doctor curing the toothache is that he get a slightly painful shot, but I don't have faith that he'll get a slightly painful shot, right? So hopefully you followed that, right? I do have faith that the doctor will cure him, and I see that there's a necessary condition of that, but I don't have faith in the necessary condition. So, desire is just the same way, right? I desire that he be cured by the dentist, but I don't desire that he get a painful shot, even though that's a necessary condition. The predicate, just it's good that, right, also works the same way. So, it looks like that's some support. Here's a third kind of fancy argument. John Hawthorne suggested this one to me. I guess it seems right to me. So It also seems like some attributions of even a denial of faith in some cases can carry with it a presupposition that you have the pro-attitude toward it, that you desire it, that you think it's good. So, John Quanvig and I are in a sports bar. The Red Sox are on. They're losing in the bottom of the ninth. So I ask him, do you have faith that they're going to pull it out, the Red Sox? I know what he would say. I think I know what he would say to that. But suppose I don't know, right? I mean, the question almost presupposes that he wants them to, right? I mean, if to deny that he has faith that the Red Sox will win, it's like he almost can't do that without explaining, doing a little bit more explanation, right? So it's a little bit like the complex question, fallacy. So, if someone asks me, have you stopped beating your wife, right? I can't just say no to that because it carries with it a presupposition that I have been. So I have to say no because I never started beating my wife. So of course I can't, right? You got to do so the claim is that there's a kind of similar thing that happens when you ask, do you have faith? Have you lost your faith that this is the case? A simple no even will carry with it the sort of idea that you want it to be true. So you have to do the further unpacking. Okay, there's a really quick set of a few arguments. But here's some reasons for no. The reasons for no are all just counterexamples, some of which aren't original to me. But here's one. One sort of counterexample is just a kind of religious belief case. So imagine a Christian fundamentalist who I think we can correctly, who you might correctly describe as having faith that hell will be well populated, right? You might describe them as having faith that this is so just because it's a kind of doctrine of faith. It's a religious doctrine, right? And they believe it, right? Now, you don't, I think, need to attribute to them the idea that that's a good thing, that they have an attitude toward that proposition that it's good for it to be true or that they want it to be true. It might be a really sensitive fundamentalist, if you can make sense of that combination of words, right? So, they just think that's just what orthodoxy requires or something like that, right? So it's a case of faith that. So there's one sort of case. Here's a second kind of case. Testimonial cases can often be described in the language of faith. And some of them are about news that's either neutral or bad. So let's see. Here's consider this start to a story. Smith tells Jones that his wife has been cheating on him. One familiar way to end the story isn't a counterexample to the conative evaluative requirement. It seems like further support. So one ending you might tell to the start of a story is that Jones rejects the Smith's testimony out of hand because he doesn't trust him. Sorry, I don't know what I'm in there. Get it back centered. So Jones might reject Smith's testimony out of hand because he doesn't trust him or because he doesn't want it to be true, doesn't want to believe it. So he might say something like, I don't believe you, I have faith in my wife, so I have faith that she's not cheating on me. That's not a counterexample. But here's a second way that an alternative ending to the story. Jones might trust Smith's testimony, even though the news is devastating for him. So he might respond to Smith, with the following: "I really hope that you're wrong. It doesn't sound like her. I'm inclined to doubt it. It'd be terrible if what you're saying is true. So it's required a lot of faith for me to believe what you're saying." But I'm prepared to take it on faith that what you're saying is true. I trust you that she's been cheating on me. So I have faith that what you've said is true, namely she's been cheating on me. So here's a case where you have faith that Jones has faith that his wife's been cheating because he took it on faith from someone whom he trusts. Okay, so there's a second kind of case. One third kind of case it seems to involve wishful thinking, where it's a kind of case where you want to believe a proposition, but you actually don't want it to be true, the proposition that you want to believe. So this can sometimes happen. Here's one case of it. Some people have faith that, I think it's correct to say they have faith that vaccines cause autism. It was inspired partly by a New Yorker article, where social psychologists have done some studies where it's really hard to talk people out of the view. People who hold the view that vaccines cause autism, really hard to convince them otherwise, even by giving them tons of evidence. So it seems like a super resilient belief. Arguably it's a kind of I don't know. Here's some pop psychology, but maybe what's going on here is that their in-group believes it, and so in solidarity with them, that influences them to have this belief that's resistant to counter evidence, or maybe they see that it's the sort of proposition where if it's true, you'd really want to believe it, so you don't cause your own child to have autism by getting them vaccinated. But maybe they don't think it's such a big deal if it happens to turn out false and they believe it. So maybe it's something like that. But make it a stark case of wishful thinking, where it really is some sort of it's resistant to evidence precisely because they're holding on to it in a kind of dogmatic way. And I think you got a case of faith there, even though you don't have to attribute to them a desire that vaccines cause autism. I mean, that would be kind of nasty to accuse them of that. I guess it's kind of nasty to accuse them of irrationality too, but they might be irrational without in a way that results in wishful thinking, in a way that in this case gives rise to a faith that claim. But still, they might want it to be the case that vaccines don't cause autism. Okay, so there's an initial case. Here's what I want to do then from here on out. We go back to a chart that the other thing I want to do here. I'm sorry, I lost my place because of the controls. Where were we?
This has been my favorite part.
Max. Okay, good. Hopefully no one suffers from vertigo or anything like that. Okay, so here I want to try to situate ordinary use of faith language into a kind of to these paradigms. So, what I have in mind here is that there are different uses of propositional faith, and I'm hoping that I've kind of sorted them out here. So one use that I think it does a good job to just explain that first counterexample, the one involving the religious fundamentalist who has faith that hell will be well populated, is just a creedal paradigm. So, it seems to me to fit ordinary use to say that, if a proposition is a religious tenet, it's got a religious content, and a person believes it as part of adopting a package of such views, a creed or what they regard as orthodoxy, then I think you can, from that, derive the conclusion that they have faith. It's correct then to say that they have faith that the proposition is true. So, evidence for this, and here I think I learned this just from, I'm picking this up just from Trent, so I don't think he'll disagree with this part of my talk. Every major...
I'm full of shit.
Okay, maybe he'll change his mind just to disagree. Every major dictionary definition of faith, includes something like the idea that faith is just a religious belief, right? So the OED has one like this that I've got in the paper, but I don't have it exactly quoted here, right? But that's what this idea captures. That's one sense of faith. Now here's my attitude toward that. I mean, that strikes me as being exactly what you have to say about ordinary use. It also strikes me as being not all that important, or it seems to me that other uses of propositional faith, ones that are more closely connected to trust, are more important, in a way more interesting. And I think that's even true for philosophy of religion. So, we heard quite a bit of this from Dan McCloyne last night. We're working on a paper where we want to try to argue that faith as understood in the Judeo-Christian tradition, religious faith, Christian faith, doesn't even have that much to do with just believing specifically religious content. I mean, the gospel writers and the writers in the Jewish tradition, they chose words that meant something closer to trust than it did to, or trust or loyalty or something like that. It didn't actually disambiguate between trust and loyalty. And I think that's the way to make sense of some really distinctive claims, in my Christian tradition that are made, like, faith is a virtue, the faith of a child is something that's good in some way. God credits faith as righteousness. I mean, there's lots of really claims that it seems like, how could you possibly make sense of the idea that faith is a virtue, even if it's just a matter of religious belief. But if it's something more along the lines of trust, So the basic point is just, this is one ordinary use. I suspect that it's not the most important one, even for people who want to think about theology. But I do also suspect that lots of people looking at faith language even might have a different hypothesis about why the broader secular use comes about. And it might come, and the thought might be, well, that originally just meant like belief in God or religious belief or something like that. And then that kind of gets extended because people discover, there isn't any evidence for belief in God. So maybe we'll just use this word for all sorts of other times when there aren't evidence for things. And I think that's exactly, wrong. So I think these other uses are actually older, the one connected with trust in particular. Okay, so there's maybe an answer to this to that first religious belief case. And it's partly concessive. That's a perfectly acceptable use of faith, but at the end of the day, there's other uses that are also important and maybe more important too. Okay. So on to ones that come from trust. Here I want to make a few claims. There are a couple of trust locutions that give rise really quickly to faith locutions. And I don't know why I can't just stop. That's where I want to be. Okay. Okay, let me just stop right there. So I'm breaking these apart a bit. One locution is just the S trusts that P. There it is. Locution. Other things being equal, I think trust goes hand in hand with faith. Often they're just parallel locutions. So faith in, the other big one that I have in mind is, S has faith in or trusts someone to do something, T to A, That one I think faith in, you can just substitute faith in, has faith in for trusts, and they just go hand in hand. They just mean the same thing. But maybe somewhat interestingly, the trust, you can't quite do that with this one. You can't say, someone has faith in someone, that P. But the fact that the trust locution can do that, I think suggests that there is this paradigm, the trusted source paradigm is what I'm going to call it. It's also, I think, closely connected to the idiom, that someone takes a proposition on faith or on trust through testimony. And, again, I think this really easily gives rise to a claim, a correct claim that someone will have faith or trust that P when they trust someone that P. One way to get convinced by that is just to look at that locution and this one, and if you think faith and trust go together, all this one did was just kind of blot out the T, right? The source of it, right? So if you trust someone that P, of course you trust that P, and if you trust that P, that seems also the same as just having faith that P. Or you could do it just by specifying the source. I think if you specify the source, you get this implication to go pretty smoothly too. I hate that I keep grabbing that. I trusted my friend that this was the case. I took it on faith. So of course, so now I've got faith that it's true what they told me. So, okay. So that's that paradigm. Now, could this explain all faith that locutions? No, right? It's not going to get nearly all of them. It's not going to get faith that, the faith that the nonprofit workers' efforts will make the world a better place. That's not based on testimony. Right, but I think it is an important. It's an important paradigm, though, and I think I've got a nice. I'm going to skip over this, but I've got. This is roughly what Elizabeth Anscombe thinks faith, in a really important sense, is, and it's you might think it's the Lockean view of faith, of Christian faith too, where what's distinctive about faith is believing God that take it that something is true. So. Taking it on trust from a source, namely where the source is God. Anscombe says that's a really super important notion of faith. And you can distinguish human faith from divine faith, human faith from Christian faith in just that way. Are you believing other people or are you believing God? That's, okay. But it seems like it can't be... you couldn't use it as to explain all the faith that claims, and in particular, you can't. One point I wanted to make is that you can't use it to explain all of the ones that fit this paradigm, the trusted action paradigm, where you trust someone to do something. Really quickly on that, because I do want to say that this one is more basic in a way, because you can understand the trusted source paradigm, trusting someone that P. You can actually understand it in terms of this one, trusting someone to do something. But really quick argument that this implication doesn't hold. Having faith that P is true doesn't imply that you trust a source that P. Might be this, if I can get down to it. One thing is cases where you trust someone to do something. Not all of them are testimonial, or not all of them derive from it. So some cases, here's a case from the empirical literature on trust. Right, this is a trust game. So there are two players. Player one goes first. If he wants, there's $10 on the table for him and $10 for his opponent. I got to stop pointing with that pointer. I keep. There's $10 for him and his opponent. If he wants, he can end the game and play right here, and they'll both go away with $10. Or he can pass to player two, who's the triangle player here, right? And the triangle player has to, if he passes, he knows in advance that the triangle player will have these two options. The triangle player can play right, in which case blue gets 15, a little bit better than the 10 that they get if they just end the game, and the triangle person gets 25, a pretty nice sum too. But the triangle giving the blue player nothing, right, and getting 40, a nice, sizable chunk. So, prisoners' dilemmas are somewhat similar to this. Here's the point. I mean, if blue plays down, that suggests that the reason, you might think the reason is that player 1 trusts player 2 to reciprocate, to play right, out of kindness for having trusted them originally. And that, in turn, is going to give rise to a faith that claim too. If they trust player 2 to play right, they'll also have faith that player 2 will play right, or they'll trust that player 2 will play right. And notice none of that's testimonial, right? I mean, in this version of the game, they're not even allowed to talk to each other. It's a stranger, right? So they're not going on evidence that's the result of testimony at all. I mean, promises are special cases because they've got both, right? You trust a source and you trust that they're going to do what they promise, right? But in this case, it looks like why this is a natural case of faith, propositional faith, and faith in someone, is that it's a case of faith in someone to act cooperatively or to act in a way that is beneficial to you. It's out of goodwill. So that seems like what makes it a case of faith deeply, not that some source was trusted. Even if you extend the model to say, well, it's kind of count as faith even if it's not a testimonial source, but some other sort of source. It's not what makes it a case of faith in this case. So that's all to say that it seems like there are lots of cases where it seems like that testimonial sort of idea won't explain these sort of cases where you have faith in or trust someone to do something. But I think you can actually get a nice explanation of trusting someone that P in terms of this one, trusting someone to do something. Because here's another arrow that seems plausible to me, if it will draw it. When this is true, that you trust someone that something is the case, you will also, I think, something of this form will also be true. You will also be trusting them, thereby be trusting them to do something, namely to have testified sincerely and reliably, or something along those lines, right? So if you trust someone that a proposition is true, you'll also thereby, have faith in them to have testified sincerely and reliably when they testified, when they said what they said, right? And given this implication that I haven't really argued for, but it seems right. If you have faith in someone to do something, you also have faith that they'll do it. You will also have another faith that claim will be true of you too, namely that you have faith that the person testified sincerely and reliably when they said what they said. Okay, so I think that's kind of neat. You get that further implication, and I think it also suggests that you can explain actually that trusting someone that P in terms of trusting them to do something. The other implication, the other direction doesn't hold, and I'll convince you of that if you need convincing. But if you have just to have faith that someone has sincerely and reliably said that P doesn't imply that you trust them that P. The basic reason for that is you might not have believed because they said it, because you trust them, right? You might have even been the one who told them P, right? In that case, if they then say it back to you, you're going to trust that they're speaking sincerely and reliably, but you're not going to trust them that it's true. But so that all suggests this to me. You can nicely explain things of the form S trusts T that P in terms of trusting someone to do something. And the explanation would just go like this. S trusts that T that P if and only if S trusts T to have testified sincerely and reliably, and S believes in part because of the trust, right? because of that trust. Okay, so that's all to say. I think this one's a deeper sense, a more fundamental sense of faith. Now, could it be the one that explains all cases of faith that? Well, again, no, it can't, because it's not going to fit. One thing it's not going to fit are just the cases that just seem like hopeful belief, like, again, the nonprofit worker who has faith that her efforts will make the world a better place. It's not obvious that she's trusting someone to do something there. I mean, she might believe in God and be trusting God to providentially, make her connect her efforts to making the world a better place, right? But that's it doesn't have to be that way, right? She might have faith that her efforts will make the world a better place, even though she's not trusting any person or anything really. It's just it's a case of faith, I think, just because it's hopeful, belief. So I need to wind down here. One further sort of thought. There are also cases where people have faith that that someone will do something, but they don't have faith in the person to do the thing. So there are cases where, one more time, there are cases where someone has faith that a person will do something, but they don't have faith in the person to do the thing. And competitive games actually do this, I think, nicely. So here's a nice Simpsons theme we got going today. So one of my favorite little Simpsons bits, Lisa playing rock, scissors, paper with Bart. Lisa thinks, poor predictable Bart always chooses rock, right? And Bart thinks, good old rock, nothing beats that. Right, so they start to play here, right? So I think it's right to say that Lisa has faith that Bart will play rock, but she doesn't have faith in him to play rock. She doesn't trust him to do it because there's no cooperative action here. And if that's not high enough stakes for you, I've got another Lord of the Rings sort of case to explain to you. So let me really quickly then turn back to the counterexamples and say how I want to deal with them, if I can find them. So there were the testimonial cases involving the neutral or bad news. So I want to say those are cases that come from the trusted source paradigm, the trust someone that P. And that's not the primary, it's not the most fundamental notion of faith. So it's not as problematic. I also think the same thing about the wishful thinking. So there, I think it's a kind of extended paradigm where of the trusted source, where what's really going on is that the person who believes vaccines cause autism is trusting a body of evidence there that vaccines cause autism. And so if you explain it in terms of a trusted action model, the fundamental faith is that this source of evidence is trustworthy and sincere. And that, it seems like she hopes and has the cognitive attitude toward. But there's one thing that gives me pause, and this will be the last thing. So I'm still holding out hope that something like the hopeful belief model, the hopeful cognitive state, or that something like what Dan has in mind might explain these cases of faith in, where you have faith in someone to do something. But one thing that gives me pause is that you can revise this Smith and Jones case where that might even be called into question. So just real quick in imparting, I've got a conjecture, but I'm not convinced of it. So I'm ending with a kind of a puzzle. So suppose you let the proposition that you have faith in be, Smith testified sincerely and reliably that my wife has been cheating on me. So that's the target proposition for Jones. So I think Jones can have faith that Smith testified sincerely and reliably that his wife has been cheating on him. Does he need to have a positive cognitive and or evaluative attitude towards that proposition in order to trust Jones that he's telling the truth and speaking sincerely and reliably? It's not going to fit the normal things you might think are that positive cognitive and evaluative attitude, because he's going to overwhelmingly prefer, I think, that Smith even be lying, right? I mean, better that he be lying than this, in this case, than to have him be speaking the truth. Because if he's speaking the truth, my wife's been cheating on me, Jones might think, right? And I don't even think he's going to want Smith to be speaking sincerely or reliably. Will he regard it as good that Smith be telling the truth? Well, not overall. I mean, I think, again, he'd think it's much better that Smith be lying and than to have it be true. But there is a conjecture, a final conjecture, that positive attitude might be satisfied just by some sort of prima facie goodness. So maybe he has an attitude that, overall it's good for Jones to tell the truth, even if in this particular case I'd rather he not be, and I don't regard it as overall good. Okay, so I'll end there. Thanks.
Okay, I'll try to go as quickly as possible so we have plenty of time for Q&A. Like Michael indicated, I pretty much accept the vast majority of what he said, find it very sensible and true. But I do want to describe one possible way out of one of the main theses. So one of the central questions was, does the S has faith that locution semantically include some information about what S is for, that S has a pro attitude? And he said that Dan's view answers that question, entails an affirmative answer to that question, and he's going to defend a negative answer to that question. And so I want to say one quick thing about something general that he says, and then make a specific proposal about how to handle two specific counterexamples. The first strategy had to do with felicity, but you have to be really careful about moving from felicitous sentences or statements or utterances to inferences about semantic values of terms in those felicitous statements. So it's also, and that's because warranted assertability conditions completely come apart from truth conditions. There are lots of falsehoods that are warrantedly assertable. Standard examples, or some examples that come to mind, are, what time is it? Well, it's 3:20. Well, it's actually 3:21 or 3:20 and some odd seconds. Or how tall is Trent? Trent's 6'1". Well, Trent's shrunk a little bit in the last decade. Trent's really like 6 3/4 of an inch or something like that. But there's all sorts of standard examples of how warranted assertability conditions and truth conditions come apart. So you got to be really careful in inferring from, hey, this faith sentence this utterance is perfectly felicitous, to therefore faith has this semantic content that's also involved in that sentence. So that's the general worry. Specifically, he gave a couple of counterexamples, I think 3. I want to talk about 2 of them. I think the third one was of a piece, but I'm not going to take a tour through the Prezi there. There was one about fundamentalists having faith that hell is populated, and then one about, and I don't know where that one came from. That one's great. That one's really the best, a really great example. The doctor one I gave last summer seminar as an example of how the standard example, the cancer one, isn't necessarily true. So who was it that said the cancer one? Finley,
Walter Kaufman.
Yeah, Walter Kaufman, right. I don't read him as much anymore as I used to, but his example was, well, if you say I have faith that I have cancer, that just sounds completely wrong. But there's all this felicity, what sounds good to me nonsense is completely relative to context. So I gave the example of, well, if your doctor just told you did, and you trust your doctor, then there's a sense in which you could, if you tell the story right, it sounds perfectly fine to say, he said I have cancer, and you say, trusting that I have cancer. So yeah, I think you can at least greatly water down the worries about that sort of thing. The fundamentalist one also, you might think, in virtue of being fundamental, maybe they really do take a pro-attitude towards hell being populated. Some of the people that I talked to about this, fundamentalist-wise, they seem to hope that hell has a high population. But even then, I think if you think of this category of faith that locutions as having as being members of the trust loyalty category, then they're not really faith that, they're not core paradigmatic faith that locutions. That even using the faith that language for these things is loose talk, or at least very non-paradigmatic talk. So because when you're trusting, when you're in these cases where the fundamentalist is just trusting what Scripture said, say, hey, Paul's the one who said this, I'm just taking Paul's word for it, and the person in the doctor case just takes the doctor's word for it. These are second personal cases. These are second personal cases. And even if, and so that the attitude towards the proposition is derived from the attitude towards the person. So one way of sort of maybe going between Dan's firm yes and Mike's firm no is, well, there's got to be a pro-attitude in there. And so if the faith that locution is robustly epistemic, it has to have, you haven't given a counterexample to that there has to be a pro-attitude towards the proposition, or it's one that ultimately relies on second personal things that comes down to a pro-attitude in a person, or a pro-attitude in a feature of a person. So in the reliable testimony that your wife is cheating on you case, your pro-attitude is towards not towards the proposition, granted, but you do have a pro-attitude towards the individual whose word you're taking that proposition on. And I tried to think, well, what can you say about that? Well, suppose it's somebody that you don't like, you don't take it for, you hate this person. They're telling you, they're giving you the evidence that your wife is cheating on you, and they're like, ha 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 ha, you know, nanny boo-boo kind of thing. Well, you still have a pro-attitude in, if you really are accepting their testimony as reliable, you have a pro-attitude towards their some epistemic feature of their personality. So maybe there's a weak thesis about pro-attitudes that survives these counterexamples, that there has to be at least, so there's two kinds of faith that locutions, ones that are robustly epistemic, you haven't even necessarily offered counterexamples against those, or there are ones that involve trust, loyalty, reliance on testimony, and in those cases, true, there's not a pro-attitude towards a proposition, but there is a pro-attitude towards a person or a feature of a person. And so there is still some being forwardness that is essential to all faith that. And I think that's all I'm going to say in the interest of time.
Okay. Yeah, I think Trent and I probably aren't too far apart. I mean, the only thing I'll say is, if a part of my ambition is to give some account of this, of the trusted action, faith in someone to do something, in terms of the faith that the person will do it. I think if you could give an account of faith in terms of faith that would be really neat. And I do. So I'm inclined to want this to be the conative evaluative requirements to be true, in a way that could help to explain that, explain this version of faith, which hopefully won't go away. And I think the fact that there's this locution, the S trust T that P, and it so quickly gives rise to the trust that P, to this one. It just strikes me that you don't have the attitude toward the proposition, the positive attitude. Maybe what Trent's right is correct, that you've got it toward the person, and I'm fine with that, because I kind of want to rest on the faith in the person. I mean, that's what I think is the prior one. So, if there's also this proposition, that you have faith that they've sincerely and reliably said it, and that's really the proposition, even the proposition that you've got the positive attitude toward, I'd be happy with that. But what does give me pause is I suspect you could have faith that, you've got cancer or your wife's been cheating, even based on an enemy's testimony. I mean, so imagine that it was an enemy who you know, you knew, you know this one thing about them. You know, they always tell the truth, right? So they're really trustworthy when it comes to the truth. But you don't take that even to be a good quality of them, because you think that makes them even more evil. They're the sort of person that, you know, it might even be better if they just lied all the time, but they actually just take the truth and use it for their own evil ends, right? So you don't even respect that feature of them. You know, embedded in them, it's a kind of vice. Well, I don't know, man. I want to be talked out of this, so I kind of want to go exactly Trent's way, so maybe I'll just leave it at that. Yeah, I'll just feel my...